He never meant to fall for her. The woman who carried years in her eyes and calm in her smile. But some connections don't ask for permission. They unfold slowly, quietly, until one day you realize you've already found home in someone you never expected. It began like most quiet days, the kind that carry no expectation, only a rhythm you don't notice until something changes it. The cafe by the sea had become his second home, a refuge from noise and people who spoke too quickly. It was all soft hums and steady motion. The scrape of a spoon, the sea's whisper just beyond the glass, the occasional laughter of strangers passing through. He liked it that way. He liked being invisible in the corner by the window, where he could watch the tide without being seen. That afternoon, though, invisibility failed him. She walked in with the ease of someone who belonged anywhere she went. Not because she tried, but because the world seemed to make space for her. A woman perhaps twice his age, with the kind of beauty that didn't ask to be noticed. She carried grace like it was weightless, a loose white sweater, hair gathered in a low twist, a book pressed against her chest. When she looked around for a seat, her eyes paused briefly on him, just long enough to make him look away first. She sat a few tables over, ordered black coffee, and began to read. But his attention drifted again and again to the gentle rhythm of her page turns. There was something magnetic about her stillness, not the absence of movement, but the quiet confidence of someone who had learned the art of peace. He wondered what kind of story she was escaping into and what kind she'd already lived. He didn't expect their first words to be so small, yet so disarming. A pen rolled off his table, stopping at her feet. When he reached for it, she bent down at the same time, their fingers meeting halfway. The touch was light, brief, but carried a surprising current, the kind that lingers even after it's gone. "Sorry," he murmured, awkward, smiling. "No need," she said, her voice calm and warm, a little amused. It seems the pen had its own plans. That smile, soft, knowing, stayed with him longer than it should have. She handed the pen back, and for a moment he caught the faint scent of jasmine, clean and understated. He wanted to say something else, anything to keep the sound of her voice near, but words failed him. The moment ended simply. She returned to her book, and he to his laptop, though neither truly focused. Every so often, their eyes met briefly, accidental, almost shy. Yet the air between them carried an unspoken awareness, a quiet pulse of curiosity neither wanted to disturb. When she finally stood to leave, she met his gaze once more and offered a gentle nod. Acknowledgement, not invitation. Still, as she walked out, he found himself watching her reflection fade in the window. He didn't know her name, her story, or why her presence had filled the quiet space around him so completely. But he knew this much. Something had shifted. The day felt different now, and so did he. The days that followed felt like waiting for something he couldn't name. He told himself it was coincidence, that she just happened to appear at the same cafe, at the same hour, with the same calm smile and weather-softened book. But coincidence, he soon realized, had a pattern. Every time he pushed open the glass door, he found her already there, near the window, in her quiet corner, the one that caught the last trace of sunlight before it slipped into the sea. He learned small things about her before learning anything at all. The way she stirred her coffee exactly 3 times. The way she looked up before turning each page, as if giving her thoughts a moment to breathe. The faint hum she made when reading something she liked. He noticed these details without meaning to, the way one notices the warmth of sunlight through glass. Unconsciously, with quiet appreciation. Their exchanges began simply. One morning, she commented on the playlist the cafe always seemed to play. Old songs, mellow and full of longing. "You notice that too?" he said. "They play the same 5 songs every afternoon." "Maybe they don't see a reason to change what already feels right," she replied, smiling slightly, her tone halfway between teasing and thoughtful. From then on, their talks became part of the rhythm. Sometimes about music, sometimes about the weather, sometimes about nothing at all. Yet each word carried more than what it said. There was a steadiness in her that drew him closer, not through invitation, but through gravity. She never overshared, yet every fragment of her speech hinted at a fuller story. He found himself wanting to listen, not to respond, but to understand. She asked about his work, his writing. He told her he came here to think, or to forget. She nodded, as though she knew what both of those meant. There was no judgment, only interest, and that made him braver than usual. Sometimes silence said more than their words. There were afternoons when they didn't speak at all, just sat in their separate spaces, the distance between them filled with a shared peace. She'd look up from her book and meet his eyes. He'd nod softly, a silent acknowledgement that neither was truly alone. He began to notice how the air changed when she entered. Conversations seemed to soften. The world slowed its pace just enough for him to notice her presence. He started timing his visits unconsciously. Not too early, not too late, hoping their paths would cross naturally, even though he knew he was shaping chance into choice. One evening, as rain tapped steadily against the window, she laughed at something he said, a small, surprised laugh that escaped her lips before she could restrain it. The sound lingered between them, bright and human. For a brief second, it felt like the world outside had paused to listen. He smiled, realizing that the line between curiosity and attachment had already blurred. And though he didn't yet call it anything, he felt it, the beginning of something fragile, wordless, and real. The first time they walked together was by accident, or maybe fate disguised in weather. The cafe had closed early that evening, clouds rolling in low and heavy over the sea. He was packing up his things when she appeared at the door, umbrella in hand, frowning softly at the rain that had begun to fall in sheets. "Do you live nearby?" he asked, voice raised slightly over the sound of water hitting the awning. "Close enough," she replied, glancing toward the narrow road lined with flickering streetlights, though not close enough to stay dry. He hesitated for a moment before offering, "I have an umbrella too, but it's barely surviving. Want to risk sharing?" She looked at him, that familiar half-smile curving her lips. "A risky offer," she said, "but I'll take it." So they walked, shoulder to shoulder under the thin fabric that bowed under the rain. Their steps fell into rhythm, shoes splashing quietly through shallow puddles. He could feel the faint brush of her sleeve against his arm, could smell her perfume even through the scent of wet asphalt and salt in the air. It wasn't a perfect silence. It was comfortable. For a while, they talked about nothing. The rain, the sea, how storms always made the town feel smaller. But then her tone shifted, almost imperceptibly. "You ever notice how it's easier to talk when no one's really listening?" she said. "Like the sound of rain keeps your secrets safe." He nodded, though his throat felt tight. "Maybe because it doesn't judge. It just listens and keeps falling." She smiled faintly, but her eyes carried something deeper. "I've had years where I forgot what that kind of quiet felt like. You start protecting yourself so much that even silence becomes heavy." He looked at her then, not as someone older or wiser, but as someone human, carrying her own ghosts gently. "I think you deserve lighter silences," he said quietly. "Ones that don't hurt to sit in." That made her stop for a moment. She turned to him, rain dripping from her hair, eyes soft with a mix of surprise and gratitude. For a second, the streetlight caught her face, half shadow, half glow, and something in him shifted. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out instinctively, adjusting the umbrella to cover him better, her fingers brushing his wrist. The touch was so small, but it left a warmth that the rain couldn't wash away. When they reached the corner where their paths divided, neither seemed eager to part. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the company and the lighter silence." He wanted to say something, stay perhaps, but the words stayed behind his teeth. She stepped away into the rain, the soft rhythm of her footsteps fading until only the sound of water remained. He stood there a long time, watching her disappear into the blur of streetlights, feeling the weight of a moment he knew would not leave him easily. Something had changed, quietly, irrevocably, and though neither had said it aloud, both of them felt it. The next few days unfolded with an unfamiliar heaviness. He went to the cafe, as usual, same corner seat, Same cup of coffee cooling too fast, but her chair by the window stayed empty. The absence felt louder than any sound. The place, once a refuge, had become a reminder. He kept glancing at the door, half expecting her to walk in with that unhurried grace, the faint scent of jasmine following her. She didn't. He tried to convince himself that it didn't matter, that what they had was just a passing connection, two lives brushing briefly before moving on. But the lie didn't settle. He'd grown used to her quiet presence, to the way she made ordinary moments feel noticed. Now, every sip of coffee felt slightly bitter, every page of his notebook too blank. On the fifth day, she finally returned. He almost didn't recognize her at first. Her hair tied up loosely, her eyes carrying the kind of fatigue that sleep can't fix. When she saw him, she smiled, but it was the polite kind, practiced, careful. She sat at her usual spot, placed her book on the table, and avoided his gaze for a long while. He debated whether to say anything, to ask where she'd been, but the air between them was different now, heavier, cautious. Finally, she broke the silence. "I needed a few days," she said softly, still not meeting his eyes. "Sometimes I disappear when I start to feel too much." He leaned back slightly, trying to hide the way her words stung. "And did disappearing help?" She looked up then, steady, composed. "It reminded me that I shouldn't forget who I am, or what people might think if they see me sitting here too often with you." There it was, the truth, spoken gently but unmistakably. The invisible line neither had dared to name now had a shape. He felt it sink between them like a wall built from her fear and his silence. "I didn't think it mattered what they thought," he said. "It shouldn't," she replied, her voice softening, "but it does. You're young. You still have time to change your mind." He wanted to laugh, not in mockery, but disbelief. Change his mind? As if feelings were switches that could be turned off. But he saw the uncertainty in her eyes. Not rejection, but protection. She wasn't pushing him away out of indifference. She was shielding something fragile, something she was afraid to lose again. The rest of the conversation drifted in half sentences. She spoke about boundaries, about not wanting to complicate something simple. He nodded, said he understood, and part of him did. But another part ached quietly. Knowing understanding didn't make it hurt less. When she finally stood to leave, she hesitated, her hand resting on the back of the chair. "You're kind," she said, voice trembling just slightly. "That's rare. Don't let the world make you forget that." And then she was gone again, leaving behind her half-finished coffee, a faint trace of perfume, and the weight of everything unsaid. He sat there long after, the rain starting again outside, realizing for the first time that silence could ache louder than words. It was almost dusk when he saw her again, this time not at the cafe, but down by the pier where the wind met the water in soft collision. She sat alone at the edge of the wooden boards, her scarf fluttering against the chill, gaze fixed on the horizon as though she was waiting for something she'd already lost. The sky was a bruised gold fading to gray. He hesitated, unsure if his presence would be welcome. But when she turned her head slightly, her eyes met his, and she smiled, a small, tired, yet genuine smile. "You found my hiding place," she said, voice light but tinged with something unspoken. He walked closer, his steps quiet against the damp wood. "Maybe it found me," he said. "You always seem to draw calm, even when everything else feels heavy." She laughed softly, eyes still on the sea. "Calm is just another kind of armor," she murmured. "You learn to look peaceful when the inside's a mess." He sat beside her, leaving just enough space for comfort, not distance. The air smelled of salt and rain. For a moment, neither spoke. The ocean did the talking, rhythmic, eternal. He could feel the ache in her silence. "I didn't mean to make things complicated," she said finally. "You're kind, and I've learned that kindness can be dangerous. It makes you want to believe again." He looked at her, trying to read the emotion hidden in her stillness. "Belief isn't dangerous," he said softly. "It's just rare. You make it feel possible." She turned toward him then, really looked at him. Her eyes glistened with a mixture of warmth and caution. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I I spent years building walls so I wouldn't need to feel this again. People talk, life changes, and feelings like this, she paused, exhaling shakily. They don't end quietly. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he let the silence stretch, the wind brushing past them like a third presence. Then, slowly, he reached out and adjusted the end of her scarf, which had slipped loose in the breeze. His fingers grazed her cheek, just for a second, warm against the cool air. She didn't move away. The gesture wasn't bold. It was reverent. Every heartbeat between them carried meaning. "I'm not here to take anything from you," he said quietly. "Not your peace, not your space. I just want to understand you. To be where you're real, not where you're guarded." Her lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, she looked away, eyes on the horizon again, tears trembling but unshed. "You shouldn't make promises like that," she whispered. "You're too young to mean them." He smiled faintly. "Then let me prove I do." The waves lapped gently below, the evening swallowing what little light remained. She exhaled, long and slow, and for the first time leaned slightly toward him. Not enough to touch, but enough to show that the distance between them was no longer just physical. They sat there until the sky turned indigo, the world fading around them, both holding on to something fragile and unnamed. The sea kept their secret, and for now, that was enough. It happened quietly, not as a grand declaration, but as something natural, inevitable, like dusk softening into night. She had invited him over one evening without overthinking it. "Just tea," she'd said over text. But he knew it wasn't about tea. It was about trust. And the way she'd phrased it, simple, unguarded, felt like the beginning of something she'd stopped running from. Her home was just as he'd imagined. Warm light, shelves lined with books that looked well-loved, faint music playing in the background, a slow jazz record that filled the air with the sound of patience. The scent of citrus and wood polish lingered, the kind of smell that makes a space feel lived in. He hesitated at the door, feeling suddenly out of place in a room that seemed to belong to time itself. "You look nervous," she said, smiling gently as she handed him a cup of tea. "I promise I don't bite." He laughed softly, his shoulders easing. "I just didn't want to intrude. This feels personal." She tilted her head, her eyes studying him with quiet affection. "You've already been in the personal parts of my mind," she said, half teasing. "This is just geography catching up." He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was warm, like an exhale. They sat across from each other on the couch, steam curling from their cups, the sound of rain faint against the windows. After a while, she set her cup down and leaned back, her expression softening into something vulnerable. "You know," she began, "I told myself I wouldn't let anyone in again. I thought I was done with all this." She gestured vaguely between them. "But then you came along, quiet, patient, and entirely too sincere for your own good." He smiled, though his voice came out low. "I didn't mean to change anything for you." "You didn't," she said. "You just reminded me what it felt like to be seen without having to explain myself." Her words settled into him like a promise. The room felt smaller now, the space between them charged yet peaceful. He could see the fine lines near her eyes when she smiled. Not flaws, but traces of living, of having loved and lost and learned. They told more truth than any words could. Then she did something unexpected. She reached across the couch and took his hand, gently, deliberately. Her fingers were warm, steady, yet trembling faintly, as though she was still testing her own courage. "You don't know yet," she said softly, a smile curving through the weight of her words, "but you're already inside my heart." For a moment, neither moved. The clock ticked softly in the background, the record crackled between notes, and all he could hear was the quiet rhythm of her breathing. He felt something in his chest loosen, not the thrill of desire, but the peace of being accepted completely and without condition. He lifted her hand slightly, brushing his thumb over her knuckles, a silent reply. There was nothing more to say. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, time stood still, as if the world itself had paused to witness the exact moment two guarded souls decided to stop pretending they weren't already intertwined. Morning came softly, the kind of morning that didn't rush to arrive. Light filtered through the linen curtains of her living room, painting gentle gold patterns across the wooden floor. He woke before her, sitting quietly with a cup of tea, watching the steam curl and fade in the still air. The house was wrapped in that tender silence that follows a night of honesty. Not heavy, not uncertain, just peacefully full. She appeared a few minutes later, barefoot, hair loosely falling over her shoulders, still wearing the serenity of sleep. "You're up early," she murmured, her voice husky from rest. He smiled. "Couldn't really sleep. It felt wrong to close my eyes when everything's finally calm." She smiled at that, small, real, and sat beside him. For a moment, they just listened to the quiet world outside. Somewhere in the distance, gulls called. The sound of the sea drifted faintly through the open window, mingling with the scent of brewed tea and rain-soaked air. Neither felt the need to fill the silence. They'd both spent too much of their lives doing that, explaining, performing, hiding what they really meant behind careful words. Now, presence was enough. "You don't regret this?" she asked finally, not looking at him. "Letting things become what they've become." He shook his head slowly. "No, regret only belongs to moments that felt wrong. This one feels right, even if it doesn't fit what the world expects." She sighed, not from sadness but from understanding. The world expects too much and understands too little. Then, after a pause, she added, "Sometimes I think the heart knows better than logic ever could." He turned toward her then, taking in the way the light touched her face, soft, alive, unguarded. She wasn't trying to hide her years. She wore them the way the sea wears its waves, constantly changing, yet always beautiful. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. "Only if it's the truth," she replied. He smiled faintly. "You make me feel grounded, like I don't have to chase anything to be enough." She looked at him then, eyes glistening with something unspoken, pride, affection, maybe love, though neither dared to name it. "You don't have to chase anything," she said softly. "Sometimes the right people just meet you where you already are." He reached for her hand, fingers brushing hers in quiet gratitude. Their hands stayed linked, resting on the arm of the couch, the gesture simple but full of meaning. Outside, the day began to unfold. A fisherman's boat pushing off, a child laughing somewhere near the shore. Life went on, but in that small living room by the sea, time had its own rhythm, slower, kinder, built from trust and quiet understanding. They didn't promise forever. They didn't need to. What they had wasn't about possession or certainty. It was about peace, the kind that comes from being truly seen and gently held, even if only for as long as life allowed. As the sunlight grew stronger, she leaned against his shoulder. He tilted his head, resting it lightly against hers. And in that stillness, the world outside faded, leaving only two hearts that had finally stopped searching, content in the quiet truth of finding home in each other.